Sure. So when I was first contacted to give a presentation, I told Carrie I was going to talk about historical ecology, and I soon figured out that really didn't make much sense unless I put it in the context of the restoration we're trying to accomplish down here at the reserve and in other places. So I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about restoration. And I'm going to start with the very basics. Let me get so I can see my own screen here. So can everybody see my screen okay? It's just a simple blue slide right now.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Okay, great. So, start at the beginning. What is ecological restoration? Sounds pretty easy, right? Ecology and you restore it. But, it gets a little more tricky than what you might consider, boy, this didn't work. What you'd call restoration of like a man-made object. It is the same term. You're trying to return something, in our case with a habitat or a natural community, to a certain condition. That's what most people think restoration means. And when you're taking a vehicle, find a junky vehicle and you fix it up, you restore it. And when we're looking at something like a vehicle, something, very simple, it's complex machinery, but very simple restoration, it's very straightforward. And why do y'all think it's pretty straightforward to restore a vehicle? Just throw out some ideas.
You can find directions.
Manual guides.
Right, exactly. I mean,
you can tell when you're done when it works.
Yeah, yeah, when you're driving down the road in it. So, that's exactly, you find some old beater car, you can usually, first of all, pretty clearly recognize the problem because you know what the past condition was. Get rid of that rust, get it running, you're all good. Put a set of wheels on this one. This one might be too far gone, the half price car. And you also know, exactly what you want at the end, because we had that reference at the beginning, and this is going to tie into kind of some of the monitoring you guys are doing. You had
grab the star.
had an idea of what it began. You know exactly what you want to accomplish as an end goal. And there's all sorts of information out there, right? I mean, you can get down to every nut and bolt, what the specifications are, how to assemble it. Every little detail is out there. When you're dealing with ecology, of course, a little more complex systems. And when we talk about ecology in light of restoration, we're typically trying to work at either the community or the ecosystem level. So, you have these levels of organization that we kind of recognize in environmental science or ecology. Usually, not always, you're not really trying just to deal with a single species. And even if you're trying to bring back, a species that's under some sort of threat, is endangered, you can't just bring back the species. You have to look at that species in context of the habitat in which it lives. And so you're dealing usually, when we talk about restoration, this community or ecosystem level. We're not trying to restore the whole biosphere. That's a little challenging right there. But usually, mostly what I'm working with here is at the community level. When we talk about doing a pitcher plant bog restoration, we're talking about that community of fauna and flora that live in a bog. You can also, of course, ecosystems a little bit, fluctuating. You can kind of enlarge or shorten down what you consider, abbreviate what you call an ecosystem, because as you can look at the definition, it's a biological community interacting organisms just like a community, but it's also dealing with their physical environment. So on some level, of course, we're dealing with the physical environment too, but I tend to concentrate more on the community. And some of these, there's some leeway in these terms, depending on who you ask. So, we start with a car. You start, there's a problem by looking at it. It makes sense to also apply observation to the environment to recognize if there's a problem, correct? So I don't know how clear this is going to show up on your screen, but this little picture here on the left is from a branch off the Fish River. And this is a little picture of, a little chunk of marsh. If you were to look at these two pictures, do you see a problem in either of them? Let's say A. Let's start with here, this one on the left that I'm pointing to. Does that look like there's any kind of problem there? Anybody?
It's like there's a lot of algae or algal growth.
There's something thick in the water there, right? How about this other picture with the little slough going through the marsh?
It's eroding.
Yeah, it's eroding, but that's just kind of like a tide line, right? Maybe. So we'll say probably a problem here, maybe a problem here. But if you go look at marshes, they sometimes look like that. Got a couple more for you. And this might be tricky for y'all. Do you think there's a problem here? I mean, that's just low tide, a lot of mud showing.
Are you talking about the plants there, perhaps?
I don't know. What do you think?
I believe they're an invasive, but I could be wrong.
So possibly a problem. Here's some pretty obvious one. You think that's a problem? This is again from Weeks Bay Canals. The one's kind of across the street from where our offices are. Can you see what those are on the branch there?
That's dead fish, right?
Right, dead fish.
That's dead fish.
Lots
That's
and
probably a
lots
problem.
of dead fish. That's probably fairly indicative of a potential problem. It's not unheard of to have fish kills, but if it happens a lot, that's probably not a good thing.
On the right, do you think that's from DO?
Oh, I'm like all these dead fish.
Yeah, on the right hand side, do you think that's as far as like dissolved oxygen? Like, why do you think that there was a fish kill like that on the right hand side?
Yeah, it's a few things that are pretty common. Is what you said, dissolved oxygen is probably the number one reason, especially in this part of the world. And another one is you can always have perhaps toxic algae that kills fish. Those are the two ones that seem to be very common around here anyways. So, we were talking about this picture here and this picture here, kind of, we don't know, this may be a problem, a little bit of an erosion. Nobody pointed out any problem with these plants. And I know that's a little blurry picture. That's Spartina alterniflora. Again, here, that's just normal. That's just where the tide goes in and out. These plants right here are Phragmites. Spartina, no big problem. We have Spartina all over the place. We have Phragmites down here. That's a little more complicated because we have a native Phragmites species and there's an invasive exotic Phragmites species, according to what the botanists tell me. So if you saw this here, probably wouldn't, in talking about coastal Alabama, you probably wouldn't really think it's much of a problem unless this was just really odd, that little bit of erosion there. But that's just the way sloughs cut in and out of marshes. All the roots there hold and a little bit gives out as the tide goes in and out. This, maybe. The thing is, this is that same Spartina marsh because it was out west. And Spartina is an invasive species on the west coast of the U.S. And the Phragmites, if it's the exotic species here, is quite a problem. And this actual picture is from up in Michigan, I do believe. and or somewhere around the Great Lakes, is an invasive species there. And the point I'm trying to get at here is that unless you know something about what should be there, what should have been, you really can't make any judgment calls. So you have to have a certain amount of background knowledge of what the fauna and flora expectations are. Spartina here, not a problem. Huge marshes of Spartina. Out west, it's a big problem for them. You can see they're trying to cut it away and till it under or something in that picture. Phragmites, the native stuff down here, not really a problem. It grows. It's just the way it is. Takes over communities, up around the Great Lakes. So when you're looking at habitat restoration, you obviously have to have some knowledge of what it should look like. That's kind of your starting point. And you don't have to read all this. These are different. There's probably dozens of definitions of what habitat or ecosystem or community, however you want to word it, restoration is. But what I circled here is kind of what I thought were key words out of these two definitions that I picked. That is, we're trying to return it to an ecosystem, that was there as far as we can ascertain. And that's a big word when you talk about ecology. And we not only have to try to figure out what was there, what is currently on site, but what is it going to be in the future? So each of these, you talk about a habitat or a natural community or an entire ecosystem, they're on a trajectory that was interrupted or changed to, somehow diminish its current condition. And we're trying to put it back on the trajectory that it would have been on. Whereas you look at a car and say, oh, I want to restore a car. I want to take it back to what it was. That's pretty clear cut. Well, as I wrote at the top of this slide, nobody was around, writing detailed descriptions of these habitats, a lot of these habitats that we work in. So how do we even determine what past conditions are? We can look now, obviously, and go out there and measure till our heart's content of what the current conditions are. But that doesn't tell much of the story, because you need to know what the past conditions are to the best that you can ascertain. And then you have to take into all the abiotic factors and all the, human elements involved that caused it to go from perhaps a natural trajectory to what we're seeing now. And then try to get it, those factors, the way we want them, to put the habitat back in the condition we want in the future. So we're creating an environment that really is as self-sustaining as possible. And we have some big factors down here along the, Gulf, on the northern Gulf of Mexico, that shape ecosystems, that shape their structure, their plant communities, and ultimately, the function those communities provide. Anybody want to take a few wild guesses on what some of the big factors are? Big events that influence our habitats down here.
Man.
What, man? Okay, what about man in particular?
They're starting to urbanize places because more people are coming to certain areas.
Sure, and when we come, we pave stuff over, we change the hydrology. What's a couple that don't have anything to do with, at least
The
one?
way you specify down here, I guess, hurricanes.
Hurricanes are huge. Hurricane rips through every, whatever the average is of the year, 8-10 years. They have massive influence on the shape of our coastal communities. They move, sediment all over the place. Man, I wish you guys were on site. We have a tract of land along Mobile Bay that has like a berm along it. Big freshwater area behind it, was full of trees. Hurricane Ivan came along, flooded that whole area, killed off almost all the trees back there. Now it's a big marsh. So these things, you know, they really shape the environment. They also bring seeds in and from other areas of really the world. Most of them don't, you know, live because they can't compete, but that is a way for exotic species to be introduced that isn't by man. It's just a natural event. So hurricanes, and there's another big factor that's kind of a mix of it occurred naturally, and then for millennia, people used it also to shape the environment. And I think you know what I'm talking about, but somebody take a guess.
Burning.
Fire.
Burning, right. Burning's like a huge one. You know, I'm always talking about burning, wanting to burn. That it's this huge influence because it changes the very structure of the community. And yeah, I have there a brief tangent. You know, a lot of times when you're in the restoration and measuring community health, people will talk about, well, we need to increase biodiversity or species richness. And I just wanted to point out that there is a difference between biodiversity and species richness. Usually when you're measuring something real quick, you're really talking about species richness. And species richness is just how many different species are in it. You know, you measure this little plot. How many species did you find there? Did you find 17 species or 57 species? When you're talking about biodiversity, you're talking about how abundant each species is. It's a little harder to measure. So when I'm doing transects along here, I'm typically not measuring biodiversity in a lot of cases. I just want to know what species are there, what species aren't there due to time constraints. You know, I have to kind of give an idea of what's going on without getting into a real in-depth study. When you're talking about biodiversity, you talk about, and I made this little graph here, you know, if you have this natural community number one here, as opposed to community two, you can see, well, they both have the same number of species involved, but number two is pretty evenly distributed. It's a very diverse community, not because of the same number of species, but because they're fairly evenly spread. This would be considered less diverse because it's so overwhelmed by, you know, one species. You know, it's like 61% of the community is just one species. And that happens, and it's not necessarily a bad sign when you go out into a marsh, you know, depending on how you're measuring by, you know, stem counts or biomass, you're in a Spartina-Peyton's marsh, that's what's there. I mean, there's a lot of other species there. It's a very rich habitat, but it's not that diverse. And that's just a little aside because there is a difference between richness and diversity that I wanted to point out. So this kind of gets us to historical ecology. You know, we're trying to figure out the past so we have some point to start to judge what we're doing. And, you know, historical ecology, you know, it's using history and ecology. Pretty self-explanatory there, but we use information from the past to make some judgments and to try to tease apart what would have, that trajectory I was talking about, what would have occurred naturally versus how we as humans have impacted the environment. And our impact on the environment is not always inherently negative. Often is, but not always. Going back, talking about fire, you know, fire has been used down in this part of the United States since people have been around, thousands and thousands of years, because people discovered, hey, light the fire, opens up the wood, provides more grazing for animals to come in, makes hunting easier, makes growing crops easier, a lot of benefits to it. So, you know, I don't automatically say that human activity is always negative. In historical ecology, and these are just some interesting images I put up here. Just, I don't know if you all have ever even know about Bottle Creek in the Tensaw Delta. It's a place with a bunch of Indian mounds. And Will and I paddled out there one day, and it's a pretty neat area. These are kind of recreations based on what the archaeologists found there of where these mounds are. And, you know, then this is, of course, a little interpretation, the picture to the right, of what it may have looked like when it was inhabited. So we have these, you know, really neat historic areas in our vicinity. I mean, this is, I think we paddled like 8 miles to this, maybe even a little less, 7, 8 miles. And, you know, you can go walk around where there used to be an ancient civilization. It's just really cool. So if you ever get the chance to go to Bottle Creek in the Mobile Tensaw Delta, I suggest you go out there. I mean, they're just big mounds now, pretty much overgrown, but, you know, if you kind of look around and let your imagination run a little bit, it's really pretty neat. History is typically considered been when there's human, a lot of people just say when there's human writing, but it's really more when there's human records, you know, and there's some evidence of them being people, being present and leaving some sort of documentation. These are all evidence of humans, right? These are from, this is cave art from Indonesia, you know, 44,000 years ago. So I think, you know, humans have been interacting and leaving their imprint on the environment and recording, at least at some level, what they encountered in their environment for tens of thousands of years. Out west, and I always wanted to go here to see some of the petroglyphs. I think this one in the upper left-hand corner is also, I can't remember which state, but it's out west somewhere. So there's some, I mean, and you look at this, you may not be able to see this very clearly. This is France, and there's pictures of lions and cave bears. You know, back when these people were living there in their caves, they were recording their environment to some extent. You know, there's the cave bear. There's, I guess, lions. Leaving evidence that's still there to this day of what their environment was like to some degree. Now that's not going into the detail we need for restoration, but it does show you things have changed. No cave bears there anymore. So, you know, when we talk about restoring and we're trying to get to some past time, well, we can't be ridiculous, right? Although it'd be awesome to have a saber-toothed cat roaming around South Alabama. Not too feasible. And this is a giant sloth. These are all North American large mammals that were here, and there's evidence of them. There's even human documentation of them. No longer here. So how do we pick what time to go back to? Well, we know we can't do this. But we can pick a time using just our observations of what is here now, what abiotic conditions have changed, you know, temperatures have changed, what kind of life and ecosystems can be supported now, and go back, hopefully, to before whatever negative impact you're trying to restore from is corrected, and then try to get back on that trajectory that started pre whatever the negative impact was. And this requires us to know a lot about how ecosystems work. We need to know something about ecology. This is kind of the fire example I picked for this because that's a very common event down here that reshapes our community. And basically what fire does, if you believe in the model of ecology where there's a climax forest, or a climax meaning like an endpoint community, I don't necessarily hold it that's true, but it is a nice way to model things. Is what we do with fire is we're kind of resetting the clock all the time of our natural community. We do know you have a burn or a big hurricane, things change. You have organisms that come up quickly, right? They're selected naturally to grow fast, reproduce quickly. And then you get the organisms, you know, if you're talking about a forest, you start getting your hardwood trees in there, some pine trees. If you were to let that go over hundreds of years, you would end up with, depending on what part of the world you are, you know, the big trees, a pretty stable understory. The whole story of habitats down in where we live, or where you're working at least currently, is this doesn't happen in a lot of areas. Things get, you know, this is kind of like that mixed deciduous and pine forest that you'll see. Fire comes along. Our pine trees down here, especially our longleaf, and also to a large extent our slash pine, are adapted to deal with fire a little bit, the longleaf in particular. You won't see this hardwood community develop. And I think you've all been here and heard me talk about how, like overlooking the marsh, how we want to run a fire through there or through the bog, knock back those hardwoods. We're interrupting this transition in the community. And we're interrupting it because we have a knowledge of the past based on records, based on dendrology, based on, you know, taking samples from the soil and putting together a past fire regime of looking at history through not just human records, but also, like I was saying, through taking tree cores and, you know, looking at soil samples and saying, well, we know fire has been a force that changed this habitat types or these habitat types for thousands and thousands of years. We can't always tell the difference, obviously, between what fires were started naturally and what ones were started by man, but we do see now species that are prevalent in what we would call less disturbed or healthier ecosystems that are fire dependent. So we can draw a very rational conclusion that the plant community and then the fauna community that depends on them have adapted over these millennia for this particular process to, or this stressor is what we usually call like a hurricane or a fire, to be recurring. We also need to know, and I'm not going to go too far in the weeds with the ecology here, but things about like how thresholds work, you know, how communities, prey and predator, and, you know, a million other things. Almost everything in nature is a kind of a threshold. It grows to a certain point and then you have somewhat of a collapse. It grows back, collapses. We need to know, you know, what's the carrying capacity and how all the energy is transferred through different trophic levels, and what species are having the biggest impact on our habitats. You know, we call them keystone and foundation species. And, you know, if you ever take ecology classes, you'll learn all about this. But, you know, when you're looking at restoration, you need to kind of consider all these dynamics that are going on. And when you look at all that, you got all your history figured out to the best you can, like we previously said. So we have a pretty good idea of what our starting point was before whatever transgression, whatever interrupted this kind of path. And you look at the abiotic factors and how conditions have changed over time. And you think, well, I think this is where we would be, you know, a quote unquote natural ecosystem versus what we're looking at today. And, you know, this can be really simple. It can be really complex. It can be really simple. Observe an ecosystem that's all, you know, popcorn trees and Japanese climbing fern. Well, we know that's not good. We know that needs to go and to be changed. And hopefully, well, just lost my slide, end up with some kind of more natural system in the future that is also strong enough to be self-perpetuating. And we may never get to that totally self-perpetuating system, if this makes sense, because fires down here, you know, they're not going to happen on their own. People put fires out. We have roads that interrupt the spread of natural fire. You know, the fire come through like where I'm at, the Weeks Bay area, it might have started 25 miles away, back before all these roads were in. It just keeps burning and burning until, naturally goes out, and it would have just run through this system. Obviously, that's not going to happen, so it can't be a self-perpetuating system from that point of view. We have to manage it. But as far as just that management application, you want the natural community within there to be healthy and resilient. Like a good example are invasive species. If you keep a natural community healthy, it will be resilient to invasive species because there's no niche for them to fill. Every niche in that ecosystem is filled up already with native plants. So those are, this is a very basic overview, of course, because you can get really lost in the weeds about, details. And sometimes, in my personal experience, you get lost in the details and you kind of lose sight of it. Well, you really don't know what it was like to begin with. You have a real good idea, but you don't have to measure every plant stem. You can kind of look at the overall structure, the overall species richness of an area and get a real good idea. So when I started looking at properties here, and I'm going to swap out that and move to this. I don't need to know about that. I started looking like I'm going to try to restore the Damson tract. I know there's problems in there. There's ditches. There's all sorts of invasive species tucked in there. The marsh seems a little bit damaged from woody species growing in there. So, I kind of laid out to myself, here's the description of what the place looks like. Let's start looking for some historical evidence of what it used to be. So I walk around in the woods, and these pictures right here are from the Damson tract. Does anybody know what these are?
Well, turpentine cuts, aren't they?
They are.
Cat faces.
Yep, they're cat faces. So, immediately you can go, well, this probably was a very open forest in the not too recent past because there's still evidence of the turpentine industry, and that kind of shut down around here somewhere in the 1940s, give or take a little bit. So we know up until then, probably all this kind of undergrowth, not a real good picture of it in the background, probably wasn't real thick, because if you wanted to use this as a getting turpentine, you wouldn't want that there. Kind of makes getting around hard. You can go to photo archives, and lo and behold, look at these are all flatwoods, like what we have here from Baldwin County. And I mean, look at that compared to what you guys work in down here. Look how open it is. And all this, how mature the trees are too is kind of interesting, but a real rich, doesn't show up so much in this black and white photo, but understory. That's what I'm always talking about, the bog in particular, be even a richer understory. And then, I found this picture. This is the mouth of Weeks Bay, and you can read the heading. But again, it kind of reaffirms that, well, okay, at least going back, 100 and whatever years it's been now, 130, 150. This is, they call it mouth of Fish River. They used to call all of Weeks Bay Fish River on old maps. Again, kind of reinforces that, look, that used to be a very open, very hardly any mid-story plants at all, very grassy underneath or herbaceous growth. More pictures that kind of say the same thing. In the recent past, I dug up some aerial photographs, these old 1941s, not real high quality, but you can see the extent of the marsh. And if I were to, this is the photo I think of our buildings right about here somewhere, I do believe. Here's the Weeks Bay, here's the marsh spit that goes out. So you can see that this is all marsh. So Highway 98, where you all drive in, I think is going to be somewhere right about where that red line is, maybe up a little further north. It was all woods, marsh, more marsh. This is that Damson tract where, I don't know if your group, some of you in the group have worked back there. You can see how open it was back in 1940. Now it's all hardwoods and pine trees, like, closed canopy. It's all open not too long ago. So I look at all this information, and, I've got much more than I'm showing you right now. And to some extent, it confirmed what I suspected all along is, and what makes sense, is the driver, like I said, is fire. That lack of fire has changed. The ditching needs to be taken care of the dead fish in the canal. That's why we're filling in the canals. So basically, I use that. I guess in my case, I kind of use it to justify what I was already suspecting, which probably isn't the way it should go. But, I'd read enough natural history about this area and about the communities and, the human history of this area to pretty much just, I knew that's what I was probably going to find, and I did find it. So that's why we're trying to return fire. And fires didn't get recognized as a real important part of habitat restoration for a long time. I think mostly because people feared the fire. You don't want your fire getting out of control, especially in a habitat, a place with a lot of people. I also brought in botanists, other people, and we did some transect work. You all have gone and helped monitor, so we can keep track of are the changes going the direction we expect and anticipate those changes to go. A couple more years, I'll go through and do another transect, species richness, see how the different zonations are changing, like especially in this marsh where it's real easy to pick up. Where we go kind of up here, we have fresh water. Well, up here we have, wet forest. Then it transitions down to kind of a freshwater caladium marsh, kind of get a mix of Juncus spartina, then it goes to Juncus. In the scrubbing zone right in here, where you're getting all those trees starting to pop up, we'll record how that changes, how that is reacting to our burn regime. And in here, as we fill up canals, there's some, I shouldn't say canals, ditches. Are things getting wetter? Is it changing the, the hydrology of the area? So, I mean, I think I only have like an hour, and I want to let y'all talk for a while and have some questions. So, that's a real quick overview of how we try to determine what we should restore to, and also clues us in on what we should measure to get there. That's why I had you guys do like forest structure, very basic forest structure. Structure doesn't always beget the function you want, but it's a good sign if we think the basal area, the total number of trees should amount to X, and we have Y, and we want to take it back to X. And that's what y'all are doing when you're out there measuring trees. So we run fires through there, 5 years from now, go measure the trees again. Are we losing trees like we want? Letting more sunlight on the ground. Your photo records, that's just like this. It's real easy to look at a photo. And even if you can't identify every individual species, which you're not going to be able to in a photo, you can certainly look at, say, the structure of this forest has changed. So now I'm just rambling. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions that people have been putting them in the chat. I think I'll pick out a few that a bunch of people have been asking.
Okay.
So a lot of people asked about fire. I think Braylon's question is pretty interesting about fire because you talk a lot about it. Braylon, if you want to ask yours.
Oh yeah. Let me scroll up to it.
It's the one you just put in there about the fire there.
Oh, so it's a two-part question. So what's the reason why fire stopped occurring naturally? And if the reason was natural, then what if burning is keeping the ecosystem from naturally evolving like it would without, the whole prevalence of fire being there?
Sure. Well, these roads, like, that's the number one reason is, human infrastructure got in the way of where natural fires would normally spread. We talk about, let me just pull that picture up. So, we always try to get this little area burned here. Well, it's surrounded by roads. There's a road here, road there. Back before all these roads were in the way, a fire might start in Fairhope and blow all the way through here. So it's just human infrastructure that's interrupting the natural fire regime. As far as the second one is like, are we stopping like what we call the successional dynamics? From the forest maturing. Yeah, that is just a whole lot of people reading a whole lot of literature, looking at the natural history of this area, and in combination with, the anthropology of the area, and then looking at what we have now and saying with these organisms, they've just adapted to fire. I mean, they've been selected for, really. And the benefits, there's like some subjectivity to everything, correct? The benefits of running the fire through here to things we enjoy, open spaces, wildlife habitat, a richer species richness, redundant, improved species richness. That probably is a little subjective, but it also fits in with the multi-millennial history of this area. I mean, there's enough evidence that, Native Americans, First Peoples, whatever, were using fire for thousands and thousands of years here. And yeah, I think we are selecting for some of the species that are disappearing due to lack of fire. But I think it's the right thing to do, personally. I think we have healthier, more resilient ecosystems by using fire than if we didn't. I hope that answered your question somewhat.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Then along with that, if Crayon wants to ask a question about fire, I think it's also pretty related.
Okay.
Yeah, basically kind of along those lines. How recently did people and governments start becoming more receptive to prescribed fire?
I think, that probably varies by what locale you're at. All these wildfires we've had out west, was it just last year, maybe it was the year before. Part of the reason there were those huge wildfires is they're suppressed for a long time, then they get out of hand. So people are starting to see not only just the ecological benefit of fire, but also the practical benefit of fire for protecting, infrastructure, human infrastructure. And I think out west, they've known that and probably enacted fire for longer. It's just more of a limit on resources. And down here, I can't say. I mean, since I've been in my career, we've known and have been trying to do fires, and I think the general public's more receptive to them now than when I started my career. And I think the understanding of why fires need to occur, even if people just think, oh, you just need to burn it to stop my house from, getting caught on fire from a wildfire, they at least accept that you need to burn. They might not understand the full ecological benefit of it, but even that's improving. And I think agencies like the one I'm in now are very keen on, noting the ecological benefit now. When that started, it was before my time, but even if the scientists, the biologists recognize the benefit, you're going to be limited by what the citizenry is comfortable with. And so overall, the condition's improving, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that probably has different time frames depending on what side of the country you're on. But in those big fires I bring up out west, kind of shows that even though they've been using fire out west for a long time, or reintroducing, it's not so much Smokey the Bear stuff anymore. And, put out every fire you see, but do controlled burns to prevent those catastrophic fires. And they obviously are well aware of the ecological benefits. I think it was Leopold, I think it was, and I may be wrong, was writing about it back in the 50s, maybe it was even the 40s. So ecologists have been aware of it for a while. It just takes a while for everything to catch on.
Awesome. So now that we know that fire is good for the environment and the problems you're facing, Eric has a question about what you're going to do with that. So Eric, you want to ask?
Hey Eric, how you doing? Are y'all planning on restoring places like the Damson track or the Meadows track? And if so, what would be the first step you'll make on restoring those?
What the Damson track, like the picture I kind of pulled up here, which is just a portion of it. Yeah, we've burned that a couple times. I've gone in there with some help and some machinery. It doesn't show up on the map. There was ditches that drained water off there because there's an agricultural field up towards the top here. It's a wet area, so they drained it. The meadows, yeah, I mean, we have a master restoration plan for that underway right now as part of the oil spill money. There's some hydrological restoration I should start probably next year. The final plan is getting written right now, and it's on its final phase of probably being approved in a few months. So yeah, we're going to see some action there. And while I have help with the hydrological restoration through some of the oil spill money, it's then going to be up to staff here and our state lands partners to continue burning and hopefully y'all continue treating exotic invasives. And that's about 90% of the restoration story. Outside of these hydrological restorations, try to get that return interval there for the burns, keep those exotic invasive species out of there long enough, because every time you burn, it kind of opens a niche for an exotic. So you have to keep the exotics pretty at bay, not just in the area you're dealing with, but in the neighboring areas, and let that natural community redevelop. And it should get easier over time. And the more you burn, the more that the grasses and the ground cover grows, the easier it carries and the less threatening the next burn is. So once you start on this, you just have to keep after it, and it does eventually get easier. And we're going to just, for information purposes, there's a lot of potential bog areas, pitcher plant bogs. In the Damson track and the Meadows track, it's all over the place, and that's a very critical habitat that's in short supply compared to what it used to be. So we anticipate seeing a lot of bog plants, that community coming back into play. Now, if we 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we've taken all these actions and we don't see that community being, restored, coming back, we might have to amend our management plan. I mean, we're certain it used to be there. We have the right soils with the right fire regime. It should be there. And so far it has come back once we've got tracks under proper management. But if not, well, we'll just go from there and make a new judgment on what we should do.
All right. And then one last question about burns. Ashley had a pretty good question about just like the past burns you've done.
Yeah, give me just a second. I'm gonna scroll back up to my question. This one's more of like just a fun question or a way. I know you've been involved with a lot of burns over your time in your position. I was just wondering what is the largest acreage-wise that you've been involved in, and do you have any like interesting story, for example, where something went wrong and how you fixed it, or just a burn you truly remember for something?
They never go wrong when we're doing it. No, I mean, well, I remember when I first started here, I think it might even been the first year I started here, I was put on a burn, never been on a burn before. And that was, of course, my most memorable burn just because of my first, but also because I didn't fully appreciate just how hot a forest fire was and how far back you could be from it and still getting scorched. And it's also the first time I saw pine trees, what we call crown. It's just, you see all this burning going on underneath them. It's fine. then all of a sudden the whole top of the pine tree just kind of goes up in flames at once. And it's pretty spectacular, especially when you're not anticipating it. Fortunately, we haven't had any real fires get out of hand. The biggest one every time I'm on a fire, I'm usually as part of the crew watching a portion of the line. Maybe, we did Perdido not too long ago. That might have been, I don't even know what the total acreage there is. It was hundreds of acres. I'm not sure what the total was, much bigger than our tracks here. So I think that day we might have burned like 500 acres, but I might be off a little bit there. Actually, sometimes those really big burns are kind of nice because unlike our area here, you're not surrounded by houses. It's out kind of in the middle of a large natural area, and you're picking off a section at a time, and you just feel a little more comfortable. Around here, we have to be so aware of where our smoke's going and how the fire's behaving that it sometimes it's with all the infrastructure, you don't want to end up putting smoke on the highway or something. So far I've been really lucky. Like I've always said, a burn that is boring is about the best burn you can be on. No big drama on any of the burns I've been on. We've had really good crews.
That's awesome.
Awesome. Then I think we'll hop off the topic of burns. I think I've looked at all the questions and I think you've answered everything about burns. But as always, everyone wants to know about books. So Britt has a question about books.
Yes, I do. Hey Eric, it's good to see you again. Do you have any recommendations for resources like books or articles on Alabama's natural ecosystem, like the history of it?
Yeah, I do. But let me write down the name and the authors because I have like probably 6 or 7 of them. And they're all sitting at my house right now. Because I was actually, since we've been kind of doing part-time at work, I've been at home reading some of them. But yeah, I can put that together for you. There's some real interesting ones. If you like, I kind of enjoy history. Not everybody does, but yeah, they're real interesting. I'll get that to you.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
I'll make a note.
Yeah, you can type in the chat box or you can email Carrie or somebody.
Yeah, I'll get it together when I get home tonight.
Awesome.
I can't remember every title. There's quite a few of them.
Do you have like a particular author that you would like to recommend, or is it a whole bunch of different books?
Not really. Matter of fact, I can't even remember the particular authors on these books, but I know they're good books. And it's not like they're any kind of series or anything. It's all different. Mostly, academics written. You can read about Bartram and his, when he came through his descriptions of the area. And most good books that talk about ecology of this area will mention, the pertinent excerpts. So you don't have to read these huge journals or anything to pick up the important information.
Awesome. Let me see how much time we have left here. Any time for one more question, maybe? I think Haley has a good question about like studying and research. You want to ask that one, Haley?
Sure. Let me find it. Scroll all the way back up to this comment. Okay. My question was, what area of ecology and/or which organism relationships do you think will be most beneficial to study and/or research in the coming years?
Oh man, that is a fantastic question that I don't have a clue about. That is tough. I don't know if you really can. Ask it one more time. I'm gonna buy some time while I'm thinking about this. Relationship?
Do what? What'd you say?
Were you asking about which organisms and which relationship?
Yeah, or just what area of ecology? I know you mentioned fire ecology a lot. It's probably going to be a big area of research and study for a while, but is there anything like besides fire or different
Well,
don't know. I mean, I'll be asking the question correctly.
I think I get what you're getting at. I honestly don't know. I just don't know. I think we have a pretty good, you can always study something more, but I think we have a pretty good handle on fire, its historic use and all that. So something by the time you're going to grad school or studying something and talking to your probably a professor that's zoomed in on whatever niche of study he's, into, that's what you're going to do because he's going to be happy with that. But they would be, there's nothing that sticks out in my mind right now that like we just don't know too much. There's always going to be new exotic and invasive species coming on. Always good subject matter, especially how to, deal with them. But again, there's 50 different roads you could go down just talking about that issue. If you kind of more of a person that wants to get in a little niche or have a broad outline of what's going on, I kind of studied a little bit of everything, and I'm not an expert at anything.
I'm in that same realm, like the broad spectrum, but I was just wondering if there was anything specific.
No, I mean it's all interesting, right? I mean,
right.
I couldn't limit that for you. It's just all too dang interesting. So this, you'll be studying whatever you're studying, and that probably won't be what you do for a living, but you'll stumble upon something that really, piques your curiosity while you're doing that, and then just follow that road. Follow the road that makes you happy, and the one that makes bills get paid too.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, it's almost 2:00, so if anybody has any burning questions, now would be the time. But I think pretty much covered everything in the chat.
I do have one question. Nice to see you again, Eric, by the way. But yes, regarding like wetland ecology and soil ecology, are there any standout schools or programs that you know of that kind of stood out to you to kind of make you feel like, okay, that's a great program if somebody was looking into starting?
I know LSU has a pretty strong, just because I've worked with people from there. I could ask Scott, our research coordinator. He's more in tune with what the academic, what schools are doing, what it currently, because I'm kind of just out in the field applying stuff. But I could certainly ask Scott, and he would be more. He deals with universities more than I do. So
yeah,
we could.
That would be awesome.
I will do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Amber, you had a question, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. I was just wondering, like, if you knew of like any time that, or any particular species, like that an invasive species was actually more beneficial to a habitat than any of the natives.
That also pertains to Haley's question that was just asked. I think there probably are. And here's what got me thinking about, well, what are the benefits of exotic species? We used to do bird surveys here, helping out University of Arizona, marsh bird surveys. They're called secretive birds because you have to play their call, wait for a response from them. And, that's how you figure out what populations of birds you have around. And we went to the so-called exotic invasive Phragmites marsh, and it had the most birds in it anywhere of our, other species, other habitats. So I started thinking along that lines as well. Everybody says this Phragmites is bad, but maybe this structure of this Phragmites is providing all sorts of, space for clams to grow and for the birds that feed on, the whole dynamics of, ecology, because the Phragmites have a little more space in between their stems than like Juncus and stuff. So yeah, it might be a different community than what you find in Spartina, but maybe there's a lot of overlap. Maybe there's organisms in there that are very beneficial to the environment. I don't know, but it sure would be nice to know. So that's a really good question. And it's a really, in maybe
Yes.
this research is underway right now. You know, I don't read the latest literature all the time. I'm kind of preoccupied doing other things. But that does seem like a very good route of inquiry, you know, because maybe some of this
Yeah,
stuff is
that's
not as harmful as we think it is. And if we knew that, we could focus our efforts, you know, in the most efficient manner. So,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
thanks.
Yeah,
what
'cause-
like had me interested in that because I read a journal article about just like with bioremediation, just like how the Phragmites and the Spartina, they hold like the heavy metals like in different parts of the plant,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and that can change the effects too.
That picture I saw, if you remember, I showed you a picture, algae, it was actually hydrilla, growing in one of our branches off here. That's a non-native. But that is one of those plants that's known to uptake a bunch of heavy metals, mercury in particular. And that branch is full of mercury. So there's probably some, you know, association there. But we were thinking, well, we're pulling this hydrilla out. Maybe we're pulling some of the mercury out of the system. Of course, then what do? Burn it and put it back in the atmosphere? Bury it in the dirt? What do you do then? But anyway, very good. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully Phragmites is good because we're not getting rid of it anytime soon.
Well, that's another thing. What point do you just, you know, say it's here, it's going to be what it's going to be?
Well, okay, it's 2:02,